The Dallas Cowboys are about to do something they haven't done in over a decade. And honestly, what I'm about to tell you might change everything about how we view this franchise heading into next season. So before we get into all of it, make sure you hit that subscribe button because this channel breaks down every single Cowboys update the moment it drops. And trust me, you do not want to miss what's coming next. All right, so let's get straight into it because there is a lot to unpack here. And I mean a lot. First off, the Cowboys are officially heading to Brazil this upcoming season. And this is massive because Dallas has not played an international game since 2014, which is absolutely wild when you think about it. Every other team in the NFL has played at least one, if not two, overseas games in the last 5 years alone, and the Cowboys somehow went double that stretch without leaving the country. Now, here's the thing that a lot of people are talking about behind the scenes, and it's the fact that Jerry Jones is giving up a home game for this Brazil matchup, which means less revenue at AT&T Stadium, and we all know how Jerry feels about that home game money. The opponent for this Rio de Janeiro showdown is still to be determined, but the fact that Dallas is finally going international tells you something about where the league is pushing these marquee franchises, and whether Jerry likes it or not, he had to give in eventually. But here's what nobody is talking about when it comes to this Brazil game, and that's the competitive disadvantage of traveling that far for what counts as a home game on your schedule. Your players are flying across the equator, dealing with time zone changes, humidity differences, and then expected to perform at the highest level against an opponent that also traveled but might be more used to these conditions. It's a small thing, but in a league where every single advantage matters, you have to wonder if this is the kind of decision that could cost you a game down the stretch. Now, let's shift gears because the real conversation happening in Cowboys Nation right now is about how this team builds its roster and whether or not Jerry Jones is finally going to change his ways. Look at what just happened in the Super Bowl. The Seattle Seahawks were one of the top spenders in free agency last year, and they just won a championship. The Patriots were right up there with them in terms of guaranteed money handed out to outside players. And here's a stat that should make every Cowboys fan absolutely furious. For at least the last decade, the team that won the Super Bowl spent more guaranteed money on a single free agent than the Cowboys spent on all their free agents combined. Let that sink in for a second. You cannot win championships by being cheap, and I don't care how good your draft picks are. The Cowboys have been running this draft and developed philosophy for years now, and while, yes, you need to hit on your picks, you also need to supplement that roster with proven talent from outside your building. Seattle is the perfect example of this because they have absolutely nailed their draft picks over the past couple of years, but they also went out and spent big money in free agency to fill the gaps. That's how you build a championship roster. You do both. You cannot just be a one-trick pony and expect to compete with the best teams in the league. And the crazy part is Jerry keeps saying he wants to win, but his wallet tells a completely different story. Speaking of roster building, let's talk about something that has Cowboys fans divided right now, and that's the potential trade for George Pickens. Now, before we get into the specifics, I want to be clear that this is all speculation at this point. There are reports floating around, and league insiders have mentioned Dallas as a potential landing spot, but nothing is confirmed. So take this with a grain of salt. The question becomes, what would the Cowboys have to give up to land a receiver like Pickens, and is it even worth it considering everything else this roster needs? One report suggested a straight-up swap involving a player like Max Crosby, but here's the reality of that situation. The Raiders would say no to that deal in a heartbeat. Max Crosby's value is closer to what the Cowboys got for Micah Parsons, which was 2 first-round picks and then some. George Pickens is probably worth a first-round pick and maybe some additional compensation similar to what the Eagles gave up for A.J. Brown, but he's not fetching 2 firsts on the open market. So if you're Dallas, you have to ask yourself, do you want to give up significant draft capital for a receiver when you have so many other holes to fill? You've got 2 first-round picks this year, a 4th-rounder, and then limited capital after that. Would you pull the trigger on a Pickens trade knowing it might cost you the assets you need to fix your defense? That's the real question, and honestly, I'm not sure there's a right answer here. The Cowboys need playmakers on offense, but they desperately need help on the defensive side of the ball, and at some point you have to prioritize. Now, let's talk about something that still stings for a lot of Cowboys fans, and that's watching former Dallas players go win championships with other teams. We literally just watched it happen again, and if you're keeping count, that's now 2 defensive ends named DeMarcus who left the Cowboys and immediately won a Super Bowl with their next team. First, it was DeMarcus Ware who went to Denver and got his ring, and now we've seen it happen again. Look, I'm happy for these guys because they deserve to win, and they went out and chased championships when it was clear Dallas wasn't going to get it done. But there's also this frustration that comes with watching players leave your team and find success elsewhere because it makes you wonder what could have been if the Cowboys had built a better supporting cast around them. DeMarcus Ware left because the team was rebuilding and couldn't afford to keep him. This most recent situation was about money and opportunity, and the player made it clear he wanted to go somewhere with a real chance to win. And guess what? He was right. So while I'm not bitter about it, I definitely feel some type of way watching former Cowboys hoist the Lombardi Trophy while we're sitting here talking about cap space and draft picks. Let's get into some free agency targets because this is where things get interesting for Dallas. One name that keeps coming up is Kam Curl, and the question is whether or not he's a realistic option for the Cowboys. Here's the deal with Curl. He was making around $4 to $5 million last season, which is absolutely affordable for Dallas if that's where his market lands. But the projections suggest he might double that number in free agency, and if that happens, you have to wonder if Jerry is actually willing to pay up. Now, Jerry has been saying all the right things about busting the budget and spending money to compete, but we've heard this song and dance before. Until I see the Cowboys actually hand out big guaranteed contracts to impact free agents, I'm going to remain skeptical. The track record just isn't there. But if Curl comes in at a reasonable price, he would be a significant upgrade at safety, and that's a position where Dallas desperately needs help. The secondary was a disaster last season, and adding a player who can actually make plays on the back end would go a long way toward fixing some of those issues. And while we're talking about the secondary, let's address the elephant in the room. The Cowboys need safeties and linebackers who actually know how to read plays and make instinctual decisions. I cannot tell you how many times I watched film from last season and saw players just guessing where the ball was going instead of reading their keys and being in the right position. There were so many plays where it wasn't just one guy's fault, but rather a complete breakdown in understanding what the offense was trying to do. You watch a guy like Luke Kuechly, who just got inducted into the Hall of Fame as a first ballot selection, and you realize what it looks like when you have a player who truly understands football at a genius level. That man was always in the right spot because he could diagnose plays before they even developed. The Cowboys have not had that kind of instinctual player on defense in a long time, and it showed up constantly last season. There were plays where linebackers were filling gaps that didn't need to be filled while the ball carrier ran completely untouched in the opposite direction. That's not a scheme problem, that's a processing problem, and it's something this team has to address through both free agency and the draft. Speaking of running backs, there's been some chatter about Kenneth Walker potentially hitting the open market and whether or not Dallas should pursue him. First of all, what a performance this guy just put on in the Super Bowl. He was absolutely electric and showed exactly why running backs still matter in this league when you have the right one. But here's the reality of the situation. If you're Seattle, why on earth would you let this guy walk after he just helped you win a championship? And if you're Kenneth Walker, why would you leave a team that just won it all and clearly knows how to use you effectively? If the only way he hits free agency is if Seattle completely lowballs him on the contract offer, and even then the Seahawks have the benefit of being a championship organization now, which means players will take less money to stay and compete for more rings. Dallas used to have that benefit back in the day, but let's be honest, the Cowboys haven't been able to sell that championship culture in a very long time. So while Kenneth Walker would be an incredible addition, I just don't see him actually making it to the open market. And even if he did, would he choose Dallas over a team with a clearer path to winning? Now let's break down what we learned from the Super Bowl because there are some major takeaways that directly apply to the Cowboys. The biggest thing that stood out to me was the defensive gap between what we saw on that field and what Dallas has been putting out there. The Seahawks defense was flying around, making plays, showing creative blitz packages, and just completely dominating at times. Now imagine asking the Cowboys defensive coordinator from last season to draw up those same exotic looks. Never in a million years would you see that kind of creativity and aggression from Dallas. The schematic difference was like watching two completely different sports, and that should tell you everything about where this team needs to improve. Your offense is good enough. That's the truth. You don't need to have some historically great offensive unit to win championships because what we saw in the Super Bowl wasn't exactly a shootout, but your defense has to be able to get stops and create chaos, and right now the Cowboys are a galaxy away from that level. The other major takeaway is about organizational aggression and willingness to make bold moves. Seattle went out and spent money in free agency. They drafted incredibly well over the past 2 years. They moved on from Pete Carroll and went in a completely different direction when they felt like change was necessary. That's what winning organizations do. They're not afraid to be aggressive and even a little desperate when the situation calls for it. Meanwhile, the Cowboys have been running the same family business operation for decades and refusing to adapt to how the modern NFL works. You cannot just sit back and wait for your draft picks to develop while other teams are actively improving their rosters through every avenue available. The confidence level in the Cowboys actually making these kinds of aggressive moves should be at about a 2 out of 10 based on recent history, and that's being generous. Let's talk about the new defensive coordinator situation because Christian Parker coming in does change some things about how the Cowboys should approach roster building. There's a philosophy in modern defense that if you can defend the run from a split safety shell, meaning that two high look, you unlock a ton of creative options on the back end. That's a core tenet of what Parker wants to do, and it's similar to what we've seen from the Mike Macdonald coaching tree. Now, the Cowboys actually have some personnel that fits this scheme, which is encouraging, but they're going to need to add pieces that can execute at a high level within this system. One name that's been mentioned is Coby Bryant, and based on what we've seen from him, he could be a really nice fit. He's aggressive, flying around the field, a former corner who successfully transitioned to safety, and exactly the kind of instinctual player this defense needs. The quote from Mike Macdonald about unlocking fun things when you can defend the run from split safety should be the blueprint for how Dallas approaches this offseason. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Changing defensive coordinators drastically impacts your player acquisition strategy. The numbers show that teams spend 2 to 3 times more money on defense in years following a coordinator change, and that makes total sense. Every coach says they'll fit their scheme to their players, but every coach also wants players that fit their vision. The great ones find a way to blend those two things together, and we saw Mike Macdonald do exactly that in Seattle. He was trying to make it work with certain linebackers early in the season, and when it wasn't clicking, they went out and made moves to get the right guys in there. That flexibility and willingness to adjust is what separates good defensive coordinators from great ones, and the Cowboys need to give Christian Parker the resources to do the same thing here. Now, for the question that every Cowboys fan has been asking themselves lately, what happens when Stephen Jones eventually takes over this organization? Is he going to be the owner and the general manager just like his father, or is Dallas finally going to bring in an outside voice to run football operations? My honest take is that if they hire anyone, it's probably going to be Will McClay, who's already in the building and has earned that level of trust over the years. I don't see them bringing in a completely outside GM unless Will decides to leave for another opportunity. There's also a scenario where Steven keeps the GM title on paper but gives significantly more power to the front office personnel who actually know what they're doing. Look, I would love it if the Cowboys stopped making the owner also be the GM because it's 2025 and every other successful organization has figured out that you need separation between ownership and football operations. But this is the Cowboys, and until they prove otherwise, I'm going to assume they'll keep running things as a family business, which means more of the same dysfunction we've been dealing with for the past 3 decades. So where does all of this leave us heading into the offseason? The Cowboys have real decisions to make about how they want to build this roster and whether or not they're actually willing to spend the money necessary to compete. The George Pickens situation is fascinating because adding a true number 1 receiver would transform this offense, but the cost might be too high given everything else this team needs to address. The defensive overhaul has to be the priority because what we watched last season was completely unacceptable, and the gap between Dallas and the teams competing for championships has never been wider. Free agency is going to tell us everything about whether Jerry Jones has actually changed his ways or if we're going to get more of the same penny-pinching approach that has kept this franchise stuck in mediocrity. The draft is crucial because with 2 first-round picks, the Cowboys have a chance to add significant talent, but they cannot afford to miss on these selections like they have so many times in the past. And the new defensive coordinator needs to be given every resource possible to fix what has been broken for far too long. My final take on all of this is simple. The Cowboys are at a crossroads, and the decisions they make over the next few months will determine whether this team takes a real step forward or continues spinning its wheels in the same spot. I want to believe that change is coming, but I've been a Cowboys fan long enough to know that hoping for change and actually seeing it are 2 very different things. The Super Bowl showed us exactly what a championship caliber team looks like, and right now Dallas is nowhere close to that standard. But with the right moves in free agency, some smart draft picks, and a willingness to finally do things differently, this roster has the potential to be so much better than what we watched last season. The question is whether or not the people making decisions are ready to stop talking about winning and actually do what it takes to win. If you made it this far in the video, do me a favor and drop a comment letting me know what you think the Cowboys' biggest priority should be this offseason. Should they go all in on George Pickens or focus that capital on fixing the defense? Would you trust Jerry to actually bust the budget like he keeps promising? And what grade would you give this organization's willingness to make aggressive moves? I read every single comment, and I want to hear what Cowboys Nation thinks about all of this because at the end of the day, we're all in this together, hoping that next year is finally the year Dallas gets back to competing for championships. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single update as this offseason develops because things are about to get very interesting very quickly, and this channel will have you covered every step of the way.